In 1976, a Princeton psychologist published a book with one of the most extraordinary claims in the history of science. His name was Julian Jaynes, and his claim was this: ancient humans were not conscious, not in the way you are right now, not with an inner voice, not with a sense of self that narrates, reflects, plans, and second guesses. The thing you experience as you, the silent speaker inside your head, didn't exist. Until roughly 3,000 years ago, humans operated on a completely different operating system, one in which the part of the brain that we now experience as our inner monologue was experienced as the voice of a god, not metaphorically, literally. When an ancient person heard a command in their head telling them to act, they didn't think, "I've decided to do this." They thought a god was speaking to them, because the neurological infrastructure that lets you recognize your own thoughts as your own hadn't developed yet. The book was called The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, and it detonated. It became a bestseller. It was nominated for the National Book Award. It was reviewed in every major publication. And then something interesting happened. The Academy tried to kill it, not because the evidence was weak, because the implications were terrifying. If Jaynes was right, then consciousness isn't a biological given. It isn't something that evolved with our species. It's a cultural technology, something humans invented, something that was learned, transmitted, and could theoretically be lost. If Jaynes was right, then the gods that every ancient civilization reported hearing, the divine commands that launched wars, built temples, and organized entire societies, were auditory hallucinations generated by the right hemisphere of the brain and interpreted by the left hemisphere as external commands. If Jaynes was right, then schizophrenia isn't a malfunction. It's a reversion, a breakdown of the modern mind back into the ancient architecture. The voices that schizophrenic patients hear are the same voices that once ran the world. The theory was dismissed as brilliant but unprovable. Jaynes was sidelined. He spent his remaining years gathering more evidence, refining the theory, and watching it get ignored by the mainstream. He died in 1997, largely forgotten. And then neuroscience started catching up. In the last 2 decades, brain imaging studies have found exactly the kind of right hemisphere auditory activation that Jaynes predicted. Research on auditory hallucinations has confirmed that the brain can generate voices that are experienced as entirely external, and archaeologists have increasingly noticed what Jaynes noticed 50 years ago, that ancient texts describe a fundamentally different relationship between humans and their own minds. The book they tried to bury is coming back. To understand why, you have to understand the theory itself. And it starts with a question most people have never thought to ask: what is the voice in your head? And when did it start talking? Right now, as you listen to this, there's a voice in your head. It might be narrating, it might be evaluating, it might be thinking about what to eat later. But it's there, a continuous internal monologue that you experience as you. You probably assume this voice has always existed, that it's as natural as breathing, that every human who ever lived experienced the same thing. Julian Jaynes said no. He argued that this inner voice, this capacity for introspection, for self-aware thought, for the internal narrative that you call consciousness, is a relatively recent development, a software upgrade, not hardware, not biology, a learned cognitive skill that emerged under extreme pressure around 1000 BCE. Before that, he proposed, the human mind was structured differently. He called it the bicameral mind. Bicameral, two chambers, like a two-chambered legislature where one side speaks and the other obeys. In the bicameral mind, the right hemisphere of the brain generated commands, decisions, instructions, warnings, and transmitted them to the left hemisphere via auditory hallucination. The left hemisphere received these commands and experienced them as external voices, the voices of gods, not metaphorical gods, not symbolic gods, voices that sounded as real as someone standing next to you. Because neurologically, the mechanism was identical. The bicameral person didn't reflect, didn't weigh options, didn't think, should I do this or that? When a novel situation arose, a crisis, a decision point, a moment requiring judgment. The right hemisphere generated a hallucinated voice that told them what to do, and they did it immediately, without question, because you don't question a god. Jaynes found his evidence in the oldest texts humanity has, the Iliad. Read the Iliad carefully, and something strange becomes apparent. The characters don't think, not once. They don't introspect. They don't deliberate. They don't weigh choices internally. Every significant decision is initiated by a god. Athena grabs Achilles by the hair and tells him not to kill Agamemnon. Apollo commands Hector. Zeus directs the battle. The humans are not protagonists making choices. They are vessels receiving instructions. The standard interpretation is that these are literary devices, metaphors for internal states. Jaynes said no. They're descriptions of what was actually happening inside these people's heads. Now compare the Iliad to the Odyssey, written perhaps a century later. In the Odyssey, something has changed. Odysseus schemes, he plans, he deceives, he has an interior life. The gods are still present, but they're becoming advisory rather than commanding. Odysseus makes choices. He argues with divine instruction. Jaynes argued this wasn't just a literary evolution. It was a record of the transition happening in real time. The bicameral mind was breaking down. Consciousness, the modern kind, the kind you have right now, was emerging. And you can watch it happen across the ancient world. The Late Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BCE, the most catastrophic civilizational failure in recorded history. Within a single generation, virtually every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean was destroyed or severely damaged. The Hittite Empire fell. Mycenaean Greece collapsed. Cities across the Levant were burned. Egypt barely survived. Trade networks that had connected the ancient world for centuries disintegrated. The cause is still debated. Earthquakes, drought, invasion by the mysterious sea peoples, probably all of them at once. Jaynes saw something else in the catastrophe. The trigger for a cognitive revolution. The bicameral mind worked in stable hierarchical societies. When everyone knows their place, when the social structure is fixed, when crises are infrequent and predictable, hallucinated commands from dead kings and gods are sufficient. The system runs. But when the world falls apart, when cities burn and populations scatter and the social hierarchies that supported the bicameral structure disintegrate, the voices stop working, the gods go silent. And this is exactly what the ancient texts describe. The literature of the first millennium BCE across multiple cultures is saturated with a single theme. The gods have abandoned us. Mesopotamian texts describe people desperately trying to hear divine commands that no longer come. The Hebrew Bible records the transition from a God who speaks directly to Moses, to Abraham audibly, commandingly, to a God who must be sought through prophets, then through scripture, then through prayer. Each step further from direct contact, the Psalms are filled with anguish. Why have you forsaken me? Why do you hide your face? Jaynes read these not as theological poetry, but as literal descriptions of neurological loss. The bicameral voices were fading, and the people experiencing this had no framework for understanding what was happening. They weren't losing faith. They were losing a neurological function. And in the gap left by the silent gods, something else had to emerge. The desperate need to cope without the voices forced a new cognitive capacity into existence. Introspection, internal deliberation, the construction of an analog self in mental space that could simulate scenarios, project into the future, and make decisions without external command. Consciousness, born not from evolution, but from catastrophe. Look at what appears in the centuries after the collapse. Oracle traditions, desperate attempts to artificially restore the lost voices, Delphi, Dodona, the oracle bones of the Shang dynasty, entire institutions built to recreate what the brain used to do naturally, divination, casting lots, reading entrails, interpreting omens. All of it attempts to outsource the decision-making that the bicameral mind once handled internally, idolatry. the obsessive creation of statues with enormous eyes, placed in temples, fed and clothed as if alive. Jaynes argued these weren't symbols, they were cognitive anchors, devices for triggering the hallucinated voices in people who could no longer hear them spontaneously. The Hebrew prohibition against graven images takes on a completely different meaning in this context. It wasn't about theology, it was about forcing the transition. Stop clinging to the old operating system. The voices aren't coming back. The theory was called unfalsifiable, speculative, brilliant, but untestable. And then neuroscience started finding the evidence. Brain imaging studies have shown that auditory hallucinations in schizophrenic patients involve activation of the right temporal parietal region, precisely the area Jaynes identified as the source of the bicameral voices. The voices schizophrenic patients hear are not random noise. They are structured, commanding, often experienced as coming from a specific direction. Patients frequently describe them as authoritative, godlike. In cultures where hearing voices carries less stigma, parts of Africa and South Asia, for example, the voices are often experienced as benevolent, ancestral guidance, spiritual counsel. The content of the hallucination is shaped by the culture. The mechanism is the same. Recent research on the default mode network, the brain system most associated with self-referential thought, the internal monologue, the narrator, has revealed that it's far more plastic than anyone assumed. It can be suppressed by meditation, disrupted by psychedelics, and it develops differently depending on cultural environment. Consciousness, it turns out, is not a fixed biological trait. It's a spectrum, and the particular form of consciousness that modern Western culture takes for granted, the relentless inner narrator, may be just one configuration among many. This is where Jaynes connects to everything we've explored on this channel. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes the mind dissolving through stages after death, each layer of the narrator peeling away. What if that's a map of consciousness being disassembled? The Gnostics said the world was created by a blind god, a demiurge who mistook itself for the supreme being. What if that blind god is the left hemisphere, the narrator that doesn't know it's narrating, the voice in your head that assumes it's in charge, the oracle at Delphi, the speaking statues of Egypt, the prophets of Israel, the Shang dynasty oracle bones? Every civilization has records of humans hearing divine voices. Jaynes is the only theorist who proposed a unified neurological explanation for all of them. And the echoes are still here. Approximately 3 to 5% of the general population hears voices. Not all of them are mentally ill. Many are high functioning. Some describe the voices as helpful, remnants of an older system that never fully shut down. Hypnosis, spirit possession, glossolalia, speaking in tongues, religious ecstasy, the trance states that every mystical tradition we've explored on this channel describes. Jaynes would say these are all moments when the modern conscious mind temporarily drops away and the older architecture surfaces, not madness, not delusion, the original mind bleeding through. The question Jaynes left unanswered is the one that matters most. If consciousness was learned once, could it be learned again differently? Could there be forms of consciousness that no human has ever experienced? Configurations that the bicameral mind and the modern narrator are both just early drafts of? Every tradition we've mapped, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Kabbalah, Taoism, the alchemical great work, Sufi annihilation, Tibetan dream practice, all of them describe practices designed to alter the configuration of consciousness itself. What if they weren't reaching back toward the bicameral mind? What if they were reaching forward toward the next operating system? Julian Jaynes died thinking his theory had failed, that it would be forgotten. It wasn't forgotten. It was ahead of schedule. A Princeton psychologist in 1976 proposed that consciousness is a cultural invention, that the gods were auditory hallucinations, and that the voice in your head is not what you think it is. 50 years later, neuroscience is finding that he was closer to the truth than anyone wanted to admit. The bicameral mind didn't disappear. It just went quiet. The gods didn't leave. We stopped being able to hear them. and the voice that replaced them, the one narrating your life right now, might just be the beginning. If this journey into the hidden history of human consciousness resonated with you, subscribe to Consciousness Cartography. We're mapping the traditions that shaped how humanity thinks about mind, spirit, and the nature of reality itself. Next, we'll explore Donald Hoffman, the scientist who has mathematical proof that nothing you see is real. The map continues.